until you're about 35 or 40, you don't really have chronological context.
Right.
For how things either improve or stay the same or deteriorate. And it's very interesting because one of the reasons I think that older people are a bit more conservative is that if you're 50, you've noticed quite a lot of things get better over the last sort of 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
But if you're 25, you haven't. And that's partly something about the pace of progress. But it's also, I think, that, as I think various people, including Steven Pinker, have noticed, that what tends to happen is that good news is slow and bad news is fast. And newspapers are interested in bad news stories. And, of course, the 24-hour news cycle, which is all about breaking news, is about bad news, generally. Whereas over a longer time frame, a lot of things just slowly get better. And one of the discussions I've been having is one about food, and two, not unrelated to food, is about provincial towns and cities in the UK. And one of my you'll find this interesting because in Reigate you've got that fantastic Lebanese place that's just opened.
Oh, Lebani,
absolutely brilliant. I think the guy came from the place in London, which was always very good.
Competar Lebanese, wasn't it?
No, I'm not sure. I thought he was from another. He might have been from both, actually. But I've already been to Lebani and Reigate, and it's fantastic. But one of the interesting things is that, which I would say, is that particularly in relation to food and restaurants and cafes and coffee and all that stuff, okay, London hasn't really got any better in 20 years. I moved there in 1988. And yeah, okay, that's a bit unfair. You've got advantages like Uber, I guess. But London's 5% better than it was 25 years ago. Whereas a town like Reigate, or where I live, which is sort of Sevenoaks, Westerham, or equally, I would say, Manchester, Newcastle, Liverpool, those places have got about 100% better in the last 25 years. And nobody talks about this. Because one of the interesting things I think that's an issue is that I'm a bit of a Georgist, and I won't go into explaining what that is. But when you get very expensive property prices, it stifles innovation. You can't afford to take risks and experiment. By contrast, when you get a weird anomaly like Berlin, where you get very low property prices, you get a huge amount of really weird experimentation.
I completely agree with that, and I think that's why East London has now become sort of the microcosm. Innovation hub, especially for food. Yeah. I mean, so I do agree with you, but I think the food is so funny. I listen to podcasts with kind of Yanks who are like, the Americans like, oh my God, the food in Britain's just horrendous. I do think the food has drastically improved in London. But I was speaking to a friend who used to supply a lot of the restaurants, and she was basically saying to me, well, a restaurant is one of the hardest businesses to get right first. Yeah. There's no way you can afford the rent in sort of West London, you know, because it's just ridiculously expensive.
You're right. I forget this, by the way. Basically, however good you are as a restaurant, it takes time, unless you're a weird overnight success like the Chiltern Firehouse or something. It takes time for you to actually establish a reputation and to establish a clientele.
Completely, but also what they've done is, you know, like how in Silicon Valley, I don't know the name of what it's actually called has escaped me, but this kind of osmosis process of everyone being like the kind of the innovation hub. That's kind of happened in East London now, because you've got all these restaurants who are championing in each other. People are moving there because the food's good. So you've got this kind of bubbling scene of kind of avant-garde restaurants, and I was saying, London opens I can't believe how mentally quick London opens a new weird restaurant. It's bonkers.
I've often wondered if someone like Waitrose could do it, just as an example, but I've often wondered if, let's take, for example, Dishoom could actually become a real estate business, by which I mean, what you do is you buy a load of real estate, okay, cheaply, then you open a Dishoom there, okay, and there's a wonderful story of this, which is when the Duke during the Peninsular Wars, which I suppose is about 1812 or something, is it round about then? So Wellington's fighting Napoleon in Spain and Portugal, and on his way back successfully, he gets really ill. And he gets ill in Po, which is where a load of British people were garrisoned anyway, I think. I've got some vague idea. But anyway, the Scottish doctor who's treating Wellington goes around Po buying up half the town. Because I imagine you could then. And when he gets back to London, and after the Duke has made a spectacular recovery, the Scottish doctor goes around London telling the stories of this miraculous place called Po with its fantastic restorative climate. And for a period in the 19th century, he must have made a fortune, because it suddenly becomes, for a period in the 19th century, before the railway went to Biarritz and Biarritz took over, and then eventually the action moved to kind of Nice and Cannes and everything. But for a period in the 19th century, Biarritz actually had, I think, the best hotel in Europe, and so on and so forth. And it was all really a marketing. It was all really a brilliant marketing scam by this Scottish doctor who treated the Duke of Wellington. And and I've always wondered, if you're Waitrose, if you're Dishoom, if you're one of those places, I guess, home house, you could actually reinvent yourself as a real estate business, because you've got essentially instant gentrification is your superpower. Sure.
No, definitely. I listened to your Madfest interview with the Dishoom founder. I thought that was brilliant. I thought that the fact that they create stories for each restaurant and like characters, I just thought was well, it's a great example of alchemy in full action. I think it was really clever.
Dishoom's Canary Wharf restaurant has a really interesting story. I think they've created this kind of spivvy, borderline criminal character, not quite criminal, but this kind of chancer and guy on the make who's created the Canary Wharf Dishoom. It's very, very funny.
I know they're and also we'll get into it when we actually kind of hit record, but the way they've brought people in for breakfast, because I think one of the things you said was like one of the questions you used to ask Ogilvy grads or whatever was like, it's like, how do you get people to eat lunch at a curry house? And they've done that, but with breakfast. It's just genius. It's absolute genius. How long have you, just conscious of time, Rory?
Because, about an hour. Yeah.
Okay, you've got
or thereabouts. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
I've got until 10, I think. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So let's jump in. Because there's so much to ask, and so I'll just do a 3, 2, 1 countdown. Let's jump in. 3, 2, 1, go. Hello there, people and listeners of the Hungry Podcast. Today I'm fizzing with excitement to welcome Rory Sutherland onto the podcast. Rory is the vice chairman of Ogilvy and Mather, as he says, an attractively vague job that allowed him to co-found a behavioural science practice within the agency. Rory is a profound writer. He writes a column called The Wiki Man for The Spectator. He's written a book called Alchemy, The Magic of Original Thinking, A World of Mind-Numbing Conformity. I mean, it's categorically one of the best books I've read. And I think it's kind of biblical mandatory reading for every challenger brand who is not trying to follow logic, who is trying to do things differently and kind of shake up categories. So, Rory, I'm very grateful for you coming on today. And, thank you so much.
Oh, it's a huge pleasure. It's a fascinating topic as well. So,
it really is.
Yeah.
So where I wanted to start is I've read and listened to so much of your work, and I think all your work is kind of like these shiny sort of polished, either like diamonds or rings. And I've listened to so much of the stuff you've talked about. What I haven't actually learned about is your creative process. And there's a footnote in your book which really kind of palpably ignited my curiosity. And it says, not a single word of this book has been written in my office, just as David Ogilvy did not write a single advertisement in the office, too many distractions. And perhaps 80% has been written on days where I had done pretty much nothing the previous day. As John Lennon observed, time spent doing nothing is rarely wasted, yet the modern world seems to do all it can to destroy the moments where alchemy might flourish. And I just thought that was delicious. And I'd love to know, kind of, first question is, what does writing mean to you? You write so much. What does it actually mean to you?
I hate the physical process, and in fact, towards the end of writing the book, I also have the interesting problem that I'm not very good at writing at structure of very, very long works, because nearly all my writing has either been obviously copywriting, where you write 200, 300, 400 words at most, or it's been journalism, where you write 600, 700, 1,000, 2,000. And the business of structuring a book was unbelievably painful to me. That was the first thing. Until my wife basically solved the problem by saying, don't structure it. Have lots of short chapters of about 800, 1,000 words, maybe 2,000 words, and break it up into lots and lots of short chapters. And so long as you keep repeating your main point, you don't need this sort of overarching narrative structure. And it seems to have worked, because people like the fact that the book is in that particular format. It's worth noting that Nassim Taleb makes this point, that what publishers consider necessary for a book is, in many ways, just a product of kind of tradition. I mean, books are all too long, by the way, but the problem is that unless you write a book that's about 80 to 100,000 words, you can't charge $19.95 for it. That's why poetry generally suffers. If you're selling a very thin, small volume, people won't pay book prices for it. It's nothing to do with quality. It's partly because it doesn't make a very good present. It looks as if you just bought a cheap book. And Nassim makes the point that books, from the Bible to anything else, some of the most important books ever written have absolutely played fast and loose with what is considered conventionally a good, structure for a book. And funnily enough, copywriters and advertising people have pointed out that since it's easier to read in narrow columns, why aren't books printed like newspapers with 2 columns to a page? Again, it's just what you might call status quo bias. It's go with the default. Don't do anything weird. And towards the end of writing the book, I got into voice dictation as well, which was a bit of a godsend, because I realised what you actually do with voice dictation is you kind of stream of consciousness it to a degree, and then you do all the editing with a keyboard. But one of the great things is that time spent merely typing is not a great use of time. Time spent editing is a much better use of time. So if you can finally train yourself to talk to a machine, voice dictation combined with then really rigorous editing thereafter is a pretty good way to produce the content. But creative process, your point about, for example, the value of some leisure and discretionary time, that nothing done in a hurry is ever very creative. That's not quite true. I'll tell you a lovely story about that, actually. So John Hegarty, the great advertising copywriter and co-founder of Bartle Bogle Hegarty, the ad agency, was doing a bit of work late in his career for the Beatles. And they said, how long will it take for you to come back with ideas for this? And he said, well, I'd like to give it 2 or 3 weeks, because nothing really good comes out of a short time scale. And Paul McCartney replied, that's not true. He said, I wrote yesterday in 15 minutes. and later, with Esprit d'Escalier, Hegarty always wishes he'd replied, yeah, but think how much better it would have been if you'd taken some time over it. It's so. By the way, I don't think he did actually write it in 15 minutes. I think he came up with the core concept in 15 minutes, but I think the actual perfection of it and the writing probably took, quite a bit longer.
The reason I love that quote is the Beatles are my favourite band by a country mile. I kind of wax lyrical about them, but what I love about them is how they just constantly reinvented themselves and were were kind of what you say in the book about being brave, about not following logic, not following convention. They were doing that years before everyone else. But the reason I asked that question about your process is because I believe creativity. I think people think creativity is this thing here, and then you've got kind of discipline and work here. And they're kind of I used to think they're dichotomous, but they're actually a duality. And there's this book called The War of Art. I don't know if you've read this.
I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Fantastic book about, and the reason I want to ask about your process, because I think if all of our listeners can develop some sort of creative process, alchemy will flourish, as John Lennon says. But I don't know if you've seen the documentary Get Back by you've seen that, and what I love about that is it goes through. You know, people think the Beatles are a genius, and they think they're just kind of this magical thing that came from the ether. But what that documentary so well describes is just the toil and the kind of the hacking at the lead to find the gold, as you put.
Yes.
And I'd love to know, kind of using that, what are some of the really bad ideas you've had to have to then create a good idea like yesterday? Because yesterday took 15 minutes, right? If you look at it in isolation.
Yeah.
But actually, if you zoom out, I think George Harrison said he wrote hundreds of songs before he even decided he could compete with Paul and John Lennon.
I think, weirdly, that although he's written fewer songs, they're probably the best the Beatles wrote, weirdly.
Thousand percent.
That's a really extreme thing to say, but I think, something like Here Comes the Sun is eternal. I think it's astonishing. That's a really interesting question. I mean, they are... It's dangerous, I think, studying outliers, looking for inspiration, because in so many ways they were freakish. None of them could read music. That's a really interesting point. It wasn't as if, and you often get this argument. I saw this argument the other day, which is that, it's disgraceful that we're making people learn maths up to the age of 18, which is Rishi Sunak's new proposal. And, it's typical of this government's war on creativity. And you go, well, First of all, I don't like the dichotomy between creativity and maths, okay? Because at a good level, maths is an extraordinarily creative problem-solving discipline. There are flights of amazing imaginative genius in mathematical problem-solving if you teach it right. The second thing is the assumption that you need to teach creativity for people to be creative is, don't get me wrong, I'm not totally averse to very much in favour of art schools, particularly sort of postgraduate or post-school art schools. But, it is worth noting that, none of the Beatles could read music, none of them had a conventional musical training at all, which I think is kind of weird when you think about it. I think that's true. That's true of actually an extraordinarily high number of musicians. They don't do it the taught way. They do it through constant experimentation or whatever it may be. And as you're right, it took him 15 minutes. It actually took him 15 years and 15 minutes. Because it takes you a certain time to get to the level of facility where you can bash out a song.
For sure. And I suppose where I'm trying to dig at this is lots of our listeners are challenger brands that start. And I think when they start, they're kind of these fountains of alchemy. They're not following logic. Most people haven't. To be honest, a lot of food and drink brands are founded with people who are so sick of being in the city. They fucking hate being in the city, and they're just bored of that kind of job. And they almost use it as their hero's journey to get out. And so lots of brands start with alchemy.
I noticed another pattern, which is that ex-bankers found food and drink brands. Funnily enough, John Hegarty himself founded a vineyard, and I think part of the reason as well is that. There's something inherently slightly unsatisfying about earning all your income through intangibles, through words, numbers, spreadsheets, presentation, etc. And for those bankers who then start a kind of vineyard or invest in a restaurant or whatever, the sheer joy in producing something physical and tangible when it first leaves the factory must be really extraordinary. Because you've actually made something, grown something, produced something, rather than jigged things around. But you're right. You're right. I mean, part of it's probably a lifestyle choice. I want to get out of the city. But there's also that, which I think is interesting, because I mean, one of the things we were talking about earlier on the podcast is the fact that very high property prices are a disaster for, we always talk about gains to agglomeration in cities, but if they're accompanied by very high property prices, a lot of the gains are actually essentially overwritten by the fact that you have property prices which prevent you from taking a risk.
No, for sure.
And you made the point as well, very wisely, that restaurants, for the most part, take time to be successful. And if you're paying kind of Knightsbridge rents while you're waiting for the clientele to appear, that's, unless you're incredibly well funded to begin with, that's a problem.
Oh, for sure. But where I think I'm trying to go with this angle... Oh, sorry, the first thing, Rory, is I appreciate you've got a dead pause at 10. Would it be possible, because I'd booked in like an hour and a half with Anna, would it be possible maybe to do, just because there's so much, I don't want to rush the interview basically, because I've done a lot of prep, so I'm just...
Well, hold on, I might be able to extend things a bit longer. How long?
Otherwise, if there's like another half an hour in the week or next week, 'cause it's not going to go live for a couple of weeks anyway.
Okay, I can do a follow-up, no problem at all.
Yeah, just because I don't want to rush the questions, because I'm really enjoying this. That would be very...
and I actually have more time than I thought, in that I've got until 10:30.
Okay, that should be plenty of time.
Yeah. I misread my calendar. Sorry. Yeah.
I always do that. So where I was trying to get at is I think a lot of our listeners will start a brand and they'll have all this alchemy at the beginning. And I suppose for listeners, just quickly, kind of the nexus of Rory's work is you can't follow logic if you really want to innovate, and innovation comes at the kind of the sides and the ancillary things where no one else is looking. If you use data doesn't tell you everything. We're going to go into this shortly.
Or you have to look at the data in a completely new and different way.
Oh, for sure.
Because, I mean, it's worth noting, this is one of the reasons, by the way, I'm in favour of teaching maths, particularly statistics, to a much higher level. Because I think people think that data effectively is equivalent to a truth. Whereas all data is really material capable of investigation, where you can look at exactly the same thing in multiple different ways. I mean, the famous marketing story of the chap who's sent out as a marketer for a shoe company to some, outlying province in Africa. And, one of them telexes back saying, there's no market here, nobody wears shoes. And the other person writes back and says, fantastic opportunity here, nobody wears shoes. You can look at the same fact in two completely different ways. And this idea that, once you have a statistic, it tells you what to do is a really, really dangerous idea. Because it leads to people effectively reading, interpreting, and deriving inferences from data in the most boring way. And then that means they all do the same things, which means you don't create economic value. But that point, by the way, that you cannot significantly innovate with what you might call derived inference from pre-existing data. There's academic and philosophical work on that. Very interesting guy called Roger L. Martin, who's a fantastic Canadian business writer, makes the point from a guy called Charles Sanders Peirce, who is a kind of 19th century American pragmatist philosopher, that you can't rely in strategy purely on what you might call deduction or induction. You need a thing which is called abductive inference, which has to some extent which has to contain a kind of flight of the imagination, a what if or suppose that, or let us assume that. You can't, you can replicate success to a degree. It's worth noting that not everything needs to be disruptive. If you've come up by accident with a very successful formula for a restaurant in a way that nobody else anticipated, it's worth opening more than one of them. But at the same time, it is worth noting that there's an inherent bias in all organisations towards doing whatever thing seems most logical.
And this is what I want to...
That's a problem.
And this is what I want to specifically talk about, because challenger brands, they start off by not... They're kind of so naive, and naivety is almost like the birth ground for alchemy, I think. So, Candy Kittens, they created gourmet... I don't even know any of these brands. Created gourmet sweets. Gourmet sweets, you had Haribo previously. There wasn't such a thing. They created a new category, charged more. As you say, pricing is kind of... Context and pricing changes everything. They've worked really, really well. I don't know if you've heard of the brand Liquid Death.
Yes,
in the States. Water. Yeah. I mean, that is just genius. If they were looking at data and if they were following logic at that, they would have created another version of Fiji water or Voss water. Yeah. That has completely disrupted categories. Rude Health, I don't know, again, like data, if you were looking at data one way, I don't know if you know Rude Health, the brand.
Not well, I know of it.
Yeah, so what they did, they'd made loads of money, and what they could have done is spent all this money on ATL campaigns or billboards, and what they decided to do was bolt on a cafe in their office in Parsons Green. Genius. I mean, you couldn't justify that to an accountant. You couldn't justify that on an Excel spreadsheet. It's probably loss-making. Why would you do that? But it's absolute genius because it's built a connection that you wouldn't be able to see on a spreadsheet. It's built all that depth. So I think that lots of these brands start with that. And I suppose if you look at restaurants as well, like Nando's, retrospectively, that makes sense in terms of getting your own cutlery and forks and, ketchup, whatever. All these ideas make sense in retrospect.
Yeah, I've tried to reverse engineer what it is that makes Nando's so successful, and it's not. It's weird because it's a strange. You could say it's basically, particularly for the young, it's the premiumization of fast food. So you remove. Quite a lot of the anxiety, by the way, of restaurants must have been created by the fact that you had to pay at the end, and people were frightened of a bill they couldn't pay. Now, Nando's kind of solves that problem because you pay for the main part of the meal up front. It's a very weird hybrid of, let's say, the Pizza Express model and the McDonald's model. When I first encountered it, I couldn't make sense of it at all because your main... You place your main order at the counter, then I think you find a table, if I'm right, and then subsequent orders like drinks or extra sides are actually delivered to you. That's kind of weird when you think about it. I mean, maybe it wasn't weird in South Africa where it started, but it defies convention in quite a lot of ways. And of course, when you have on-app ordering, some of those anomalies put it in a very strong place, actually.
Because?
Simply because it's the way in which your restaurant system works might well be far better attuned to different forms of interaction than the more conventional. There's also a really interesting thing which suddenly occurred to me psychologically about restaurants, which is if you can create a restaurant which feels a bit like a cafe, okay. And what's the difference between a cafe and a restaurant? Well, one way of answering that is that when you sit down in a restaurant, you are socially obliged by implication to order a reasonably substantial amount of food, okay. If you go into a cafe, you can order food, but it's totally acceptable just to have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea. And so entering a restaurant is a much bigger commitment than entering a cafe. Because if you wander into a cafe, you can kind of just spend, £1.75 or £2.80 and clear off, and nobody thinks you've done anything weird. Whereas if you go and sit down in a fancy restaurant, you just say, "Can I have a cup of coffee, please?" I mean, I did it the other day. There was a sort of fusion Thai Vietnamese place in Beckenham. And my daughter was seeing a friend, and I couldn't be bothered to drive home for the hour she was seeing the friend. So I just wandered off and had a bowl of... Now, it was 6 o'clock in the evening, and I just had a bowl of Tum Yum Gong, which you can do at 6 o'clock in the evening. But had I wandered into the place when it was busy, said, table for one, please, and just ordered a bowl of soup, okay, it would have been weird. And an extraordinary amount of human behaviour is driven, I think, by the urge not to feel weird. I always argue that Coca-Cola is the most successful soft drink in the world because there's virtually no context in which it is weird to order one. You know, yeah. Okay, imagine by contrast. You know, you're at a funeral and you go, "Has anybody got any Dr. Pepper?" Right? Okay.
That's almost like letting off a fart at a funeral as well.
It is exactly that. Yeah, it's absolutely that. And there's something totally weird about it, which is you can go to a Michelin-starred restaurant, you can go to a beach shack in, you know, Zanzibar, and you can walk up to the place and say, "I'll have a Coke," with the confident expectation that what would be weird would be for them not to have it, not for you to ask.
It's so fascinating. I think what you've said there about this cafe versus restaurant.
Yeah.
Have you? I think. Do you know the Breakfast Club?
Yeah.
I think
I'd love to go.
But they had roaring success, I think, because they could charge. They almost hit the sweet spot in between a restaurant and like a calf. And by doing that, they've kind of had conglomerate success. But I think it's really interesting. But it kind of goes back to everything you're saying and this is where I think it would be real value for our listeners is not looking where everyone else is looking.
No.
And if we apply this to supermarkets, so a lot of our listeners are brands trying to get into supermarkets. And one of the biggest, I suppose, hurdles they come across is when they've got to try and increase their distribution or just increase their sales. And ultimately, kind of lazy data-led innovation will basically, what they'll do is change the format, if that makes sense. So they may go from a small jar to a medi jar, 1 bar of protein bars to 4 bars of protein bars. It's innovation. It will move the needle slightly, but real innovation, and I think this is what you're saying in your book, comes from where no one is looking. And what I want to try and dig into, Rory,
one of the worst things that happens there is you lose the quirkiness in packaging that makes you seem artisan. And so you have scarcity value, you have gift-giving value when you're packaged in a particular way. And if you adopt mainstream supermarket packaging, that kind of goes. You know, it's the handwritten sticker on the jam that disappears. And you lose a certain amount of perceived value when you effectively acknowledge that you're mass.
Yeah, you're no longer one of the early adopters, and that's how the white mousy that I sent you, the chili oil, as I said, that they've done a sterling job, no experience whatsoever. They decided to charge $7.99 for a chili oil, but suddenly the context of that, as you say, like in your book, price and actually words change the taste of biscuits, and I think there's so much in that for our listeners, how they can use price as for context, I suppose, so changing the context of things, and then words to change the taste of things. Could you expand on that a bit more? Because I think there's real gems of wisdom there for our listeners.
Yeah, it's very common for people, particularly people who studied economics, to underprice things because they don't realise that a lot of consumption is occasion-driven or significance-driven. We buy things for what they mean and not what they are. And the example I gave to someone yesterday is that this doesn't really work in male clothing, but it does work in female clothing, is, if you're attending your best friend's wedding, then, to be honest, practically, from a practical point of view, everybody could get away with going and buying something from Zara. If you're ingenious, you could get away with buying something from Primark, right? But you don't. You feel that the occasion requires, I don't know, 100 quid, 200 quid, whatever, okay? It demands greater expenditure. Gift giving requires a visible mark of expense as a signal of generosity. Hospitality requires that. And so one of the most interesting stories, I think, and it's a really fascinating story, which isn't in my book because it kind of happened after I wrote the book, is British sparkling wine. Now, about the cheapest you can sell British sparkling wine for is £8.95. At its best, British sparkling wine, Squerries, Chapeldown, etc., is very, very good. Is it as good as the best vintage champagne? Possibly not. We can have that argument, but it's a contender. Okay. Now, the interesting thing, and I think it was a former Heineken marketer who discovered this at Chapeldown, is that most champagne is bought not for personal consumption, but it's to impress someone else with your generosity, hospitality, or whatever. So long as there's the slightest suspicion that you paid £8.95 a bottle, it doesn't matter how good the booze is, it's not working. Okay? Because champagne at a wedding, champagne as a present, champagne as a congratulatory gift, champagne as a thank you, champagne to impress girlfriend, okay? One of the great magical things about champagne is it doesn't exist really below the 20 quid a bottle. Well, that's not quite true. But it doesn't exist certainly below the £14 a bottle price point. And for that, you've got to look. And that fact that, that fact is really interesting because it doesn't matter how good British sparkling wine is. If the recipient or the giver or the consumer assumes that other people may be assuming you paid £6.94, probably £8.95 for it, okay, it's not as good. It's not doing its job. And it's very, very hard. It's a Veblen good if you want to use economic language to a degree. But understanding this fact that also undoubtedly price changes the way things taste to an extent, in that fundamentally our brains will process something. There are huge experiments with wine about this, which is if you tell people a wine costs 35 quid, they will consistently report it as better, significantly better, than if you tell them it costs, £8.99, £12.99. We get really into the field here of kind of epistemology and the science of human perception, which is we don't just taste with our tongues, we taste with our ears. And if you made that chili oil cheaper, the other argument I've heard, which is interesting, is that brands achieve a certain salience by being priced at a level that slightly hurts. And it may be that the person is conscious of paying a premium for it and therefore feels required to post-rationalise its excellence as a justification for their behaviour, which has the consequence of making it taste better. Now, I have no idea of the mechanism by which this works. I just know there are enough cases where I've seen it work. A very early case as a behavioural science practitioner was, I think it was KFC in South Africa, who had a product that wasn't selling. And I just mischievously said, put the price up. And, for a second, they looked at me as if I'm bonkers. But actually, they put the price up, in a rare case of someone actually listening to me, and sales went up quite dramatically. Now, there are two reasons I make that recommendation. It's less likely that putting the price up will increase sales than putting the price down, but it's a much more valuable discovery when it works, okay? That's the first point, okay? Any idiot can basically, sell more by giving the shit away, right? That's not what marketing is about. Marketing is getting people to pay a willing premium, for things they didn't know they wanted. Okay, it's not about bribing people to buy your product. And possibly, and this is again, we're always dealing to some extent in the field of speculative post-rationalisation. In a way, there are two reasons you go to KFC. You go to KFC for a bargain, or you go for a treat. And KFC already has a pretty good bargain menu. I quite like the little chicken burgers, chicken.
Oh, they're delicious.
Burgers.
Yeah, they're so banging.
Yeah. But I much prefer. By the way, although I'm a very big admirer of McDonald's, I actually prefer KFC, and it occurs to me that it's less fascist. with a McDonald's, you're basically required to eat it in a specific way. What I like about KFC is that you can kind of pimp your food. You can pour gravy on something, you can dip something in something else. Anyway, but you either go for a bargain or you go for a treat. And if you price something at a level where it's too expensive to be a bargain and too cheap to be a treat, you won't sell to any of the people coming in. I mean, Five Guys is a fantastic case, I think, of really, really clever pricing. In that what they did, it's worth noting that Five Guys didn't premiumize burgers conventionally. They didn't just make everything really expensive. Okay, it was a bit cleverer than that. One, you can charge £10 for a burger in an environment which is possibly less fancy than a McDonald's. That's interesting. Everybody kind of knew you could charge £10 for a burger if you had knives and forks and table linen and where would you like to sit, sir. But they didn't know that you could create a place that, was actually possibly cheaper to create than a McDonald's. But you could still charge £10 for a burger. But they were clever in that the burger, which is the hero product, which you're willing to pay for, that's the treat, the price is very high. With the single exception of the milkshake, the price of everything else is either unquantifiable or quite reasonable. So in the case of the fries, yes, the fries are reasonably expensive, but they give you a whole scoop of extra fries. So you only need to ask for a small fries and you'll be perfectly well fed. The peanuts are free, the drinks refills are free, all the toppings, all the extras on the burger are free. Okay? And so, either you get free refills, which makes effectively price comparison kind of impossible, because or you get free extras, or the food's free in its entirety, and it gets you paying the premium for the burger, which is the area where people are probably prepared to believe that you get what you pay for.
Completely. It's fascinating that, and I also think with Five Guys, the genius. I don't know if you've obviously been into the branch, but they've got all that social proof. All the they basically said every celebrity or every all that social proof as you're going and you're in the queue, and it's like it could be a picture of Victoria Beckham eating a burger, which that would probably never happen. It could be.
UK Five Guys, they get actually. Cut and paste articles from things like the Philadelphia Inquirer.
It's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah.
But it adds that American vibe to it, which I think, I don't know, maybe that is me just kind of subconsciously picking up on that.
No,
but as you go through to the queue, I'm just thinking this burger's going to be incredible. And then the free toppings piece, I don't know where the kind of, if you want to talk about the alchemy in that, but I'm assuming that most people aren't, unless you're a real glutton, going to order every single topping. Maybe there's an average of 3 or 4 and they've worked that out. But the perceived value, you think, they're being generous, kind of the rule of reciprocity, all that. I don't know, there's something in that which allows them to premiumise the burger.
Well, there's a funny story I've got about that, which is, in its very early incarnation, I went to a Five Guys in Phoenix, not knowing what it was. I was just walking around downtown Phoenix so that I can go and eat there. I thought it could have been a standalone. I didn't even realise it was a chain. And to be absolutely honest, I didn't think the meal was all that. I thought it was pretty nice, but I wasn't, aghast at how good it was. And the extent to which the hype produces the taste. Very, very uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable for rationalists and probably for chefs to acknowledge that, a part of your popularity is created by front of house, and it's created by marketing, and it's created by expectation, and so on and so forth. There are also wonderful aspects, I think, in service culture, where you could do very small things that make a huge difference. One of the things I particularly like is if they ask you which of 2 tables you prefer. Okay, now obviously that isn't always possible. If they say, would you rather go by the window or would you rather go by, in a booth, for example? That maybe there's a fat guy there uncertain whether I'll fit into the booth. But there's something very, there are certain things in service culture which can be absolutely, where small things can have a disproportionate effect. And that's both the curse and the value of psychology. The curse of psychology is that it's messy. There are no absolutely fixed rules. The opposite of a good idea can be a very good idea can be a good idea. You can have a case where a logical idea fails and an illogical idea succeeds. It's messy. It requires experimentation. The upside is that you can sometimes discover things that pay off, not with a sort of cost benefit, not with a return of 1.5 to 1. You can discover things that pay off 20 to 1.
And there's I don't know if you know Anthony Bourdain, but there's Anthony Bourdain when he goes and speaks to Marco Pierre White, and they're on this Marco Pierre White's pig farm, I think it is. And Marco says to Bourdain, he says, everyone thinks a restaurant is food, in this order, food, service, setting. And he goes, it's absolutely not that. It's service, setting, food. So you need to get the service right, the setting, and then all those, the service and the setting, essentially, the context will make the food taste better. So it's like, if I give you a spaghetti vongole in a grim Manchester dormitory, it's going to taste pretty revolting. If I give you that same thing, in Ibiza under the kind of the sparkling sunshine, it's going to taste 10 times better. And I think it's fascinating. Of that are
things like, for example, Pernod, which tastes shit unless you're in France. I mean, seriously, the number of Brits, and actually, this is a good way to lose money, which is you go to the Caribbean, and somebody I know knows someone who did this, and they were served this banana liqueur, which they were convinced was the most delicious thing they'd ever had in their life. So they bought the importation rights and bought 12 bottles back to the UK and invited their friends round, and everybody agreed it tasted completely rank, because if you're not on a Caribbean beach, a banana liqueur is a completely different thing. Pernod in France, I enjoy it. I drink pastis quite a bit in France outside a cafe in warm weather. If you try and drink it in the UK, even in warm weather in the UK, it's disgusting. I have no idea what's going on there. Rosé wine tastes better by the sea. And here's where I think the as-if problem with economics arises, which is, if something looks economically logical, they say, that's because of economics, nothing to see here, move on. And the example, I was talking to an economics teacher, and I was saying, here is a great question to set young economists, okay? Please explain why there are more fish restaurants in seaside towns. And 99 out of 100 people are going to go on about blah, 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 access to supply chain, access to fresh produce, blah, 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 reduced transportation costs, okay? Right? And, those people deserve a tick and, an A-. But actually, if you delve into that a bit, the best place to buy fish is Billingsgate Market. It's probably not the seaside, right? Okay? And my contention is that setting, that fish taste better by the sea, and when you're by the sea, not only does fish taste better, but you're disproportionately inclined to eat fish by dint of where you are. And so even people who don't eat fish very often will go, when I'm on the seafront, I'll have some fish and chips. And I find it really interesting because, there's an accurate economic answer to that question, which makes sense, but maybe simply a plausible reason. It's not the real reason. By the way, what that means is that Marco Pierre White is basically an Austrian school economist, by which I mean that he believes that perception is as great a part of value creation as manufacturing is. And by the way, for a chef to say that, when you think about it, because they're principally engaged in the manufacturing of them, admittedly he's more than a chef, he's a restaurateur. But for someone whose caught is really, when you think about it, remarkable. It's a bit like getting creative advertising people to say, nah, it's good account handling. That's the secret, really. The creative work's a bit secondary. Okay?
For sure. And what I want to go into now is, I think, in context, it's so easy to understand context in terms of like fish tasting better by the sea. As you say, wine tastes better when it's poured out of a heavier bottle. The other thing you say in the book is, and I suppose this would work for our chocolate, is saying where the product is from. So us saying what it is from St. Vincent automatically makes it taste better.
Because St. Vincent, I think, has the highest concentration of people called Sutherland.
Oh, happy days. So we got one customer then.
It might be the Grenadines, actually. But yeah, you've definitely got one customer because they're family. To be honest, I'm not sure they're always blood relations, if you get my drift. But no, it's always fascinated me for that reason. But no, and also it's a small Caribbean island, so small implies scarcity. It implies exoticism. I mean, that's the slight curse of Fiji water. When you think about it, it is slightly wacko transporting water halfway around the world.
But it's just, I know that's always been, and also just how they've got the label inside the bottle, if that makes sense. There's something about that again which you can't probably put on an Excel spreadsheet. But what I want to go into is how can our listeners change the context on a shelf edge, if that makes sense? Because a shopper's going around a supermarket, they're looking at a category. I don't know, if we look at like maybe protein bars, for example, there's bucket loads of protein bars.
Yeah.
And I suppose logic would say, right, we've raised some money. Let's look at the Excel spreadsheet. Let's do a SWOT analysis. Let's see where we're priced. How many promotions can we do? Which ultimately is going to devalue the brand. That's kind of the thinking with a lot of these investors that come into brands. It's just very logical in its data because they need a return on investment.
And by the way, a lot of the things that made you successful may well have been trialing, which isn't the same as promotion. Because one spoonful of that Japanese chili,
oil,
chili oil is a revelation. It's an epiphany, and I'm not. If you merely see that. Also, by the way, it's worth noting that the price comparison is going to be different at Tesco than it is, at Whole Foods.
Yeah.
Okay, Whole Foods, something that costs $9.99, it's all bargain. Okay, right.
Yeah.
If you've been buying things that cost £1.50, £2.25, something that's $8.99. It's why actually I think Tesco and Sainsbury's probably did the right thing by creating Argos within the store, because it's difficult to sell a television at Tesco for that reason. Because you walk into Tesco with a mindset of 50 quid, 100 quid, 150 quid. And so spending 400 quid on a 4K TV, even when it's a bargain, kind of feels expensive at Tesco in a way it doesn't at Currys. And then you've also got the fact, by the way, that I don't know, and I'm probably doing them a disservice, but there are some odd blind spots in terms of supermarkets' contextual placement of products. Okay, so one thing that's always struck me as nuts is if you want to buy really posh sugar lumps or even those brown crystals on a stick, okay, for a dinner party, those aren't next to posh tea and coffee in a supermarket, they're next to flour. And that's because someone a long time ago defined sugar as a baking good, which if you're buying great sacks of the stuff is exactly what it is, probably, okay, unless you're... But sugar lumps patently aren't a baking good, right? But because they're sugar, they're not placed next to the Twinings this or the super premium teas from the Good Brew Company. Instead, they're plonked next to flour. Now, by the way, there's no reason they couldn't be in both places. But for whatever reason, supermarkets don't like having, apart from gondola ends, they don't like having the same product appear twice in the store. But
they have.
If you think about what a farmer's market or what a kind of artisan deli tells you, okay. First of all, we have curated this stuff. We have chosen this stuff. There's someone there who can tell you stories. Suddenly, you become a little bit more mute. The assumptions that people will make of you when they see you on the shelf in a kind of deli run by a passionate cheesemonger who's brought the Comte over from France, especially that week. They're not going to have the same aura around your product when it's in a supermarket. I often talk about, if you want to understand brand value, by the way, I often talk about it negatively where we all understand it, okay? So if I gave you a really nice sweater, all right, Yeah. And then I told you, by the way, it used to belong to Fred West. Okay, I'm fairly confident, unless you're a sick serial killer obsessive. Okay, you probably never wear it. Okay, and you look at it with kind of disgust. Branding is kind of like that in reverse, if you see what I mean. It just adds emotional value to something. We all understand it about negatives. You know, if you tell a negative story about something, you know, there's a wonderful bit of estate agent writing, by the way. Sorry about the serial killer focus. Dennis Nielsen's own top floor flat in Muswell Hill came up for sale at a remarkably low price. Okay, now the estate agent's in a bit of a quandary because people might want to know why the price is relatively low, but also you can't sell someone an apartment at full price and then have them discover 3 months later that it was the scene of, you know, this whole series of brutal murders, you know, where people were hidden under the floorboards, etc. And the solution to this would be, I think that the copy line on the listing for Dennis Nielsen's flat was, prospective purchasers are advised to research the history of the property. They're not prepared to be as blunt as to say, hey, get yourself a bargain. There was a serious problem.
I'm fascinated with is how words can change things so much, and it's what you said about in the book about Stella being reassuringly expensive. And at one point you had there, and I'm just trying to connect the dots here, but what you're talking about at the beginning is how London's maybe increased 5% net, whereas somewhere like Liverpool, Sheffield, Manchester have really kicked off.
I'm becoming a provincialist, which is that one of the things I go against now is this assumption that the futurism means urbanisation, ever greater density of people living in high-rise accommodation. Okay, and first of all, it's not necessary. Okay, I live in Kent. The population of Kent is 1.8 million. Okay, population of Essex is 1.8 million. There you have, you know, half the London population living to a great extent. Okay, there's the Medway towns, there's Colchester, Southend, Canterbury, but effectively living in a rural or semi-rural idyll. Okay, and there's room for another 1 million people in Kent without us even noticing if you built a new town somewhere. Okay, so first of all, I don't think the agglomeration is necessary. Secondly, I think what we've done is we've looked at gains to agglomeration in terms of economic growth without looking at the downside, which is that high property prices eventually mean. Okay, I was in an extreme case, okay, and I've got a really good case because you might have been to the food festival in Abergavenny. I don't know if you have or haven't.
I've heard of it. It's very revered.
But, Abergavenny is seen as this absolute culinary mecca. Okay, now, I grew up 8 miles from Abergavenny. If you'd suggested to anybody in 1979 that Abergavenny would be seen as a culinary mecca, they would have laughed their heads off, okay, because, you know, there was Vin Sullivan, who was one. There were a couple of high-end food shops, as you'd expect in a town of kind of 16,000 people. But the idea that it would be seen as kind of almost emblematic of all that is good in British food would have seemed comical. In fairness to the Taffs, and I am one, you know, the raw materials have always been good in Wales. I'll defend them on those grounds. I think, you know, basic vegetables, you know, meat have been pretty good. But the extent to which now I'm actually more excited in a way going to, well, at the top of the, you know, top end, Manchester, Newcastle, Liverpool, I'm more excited shifting out new restaurant ideas in Folkestone, okay, than I am in London. Okay, is, I think, emblematic of that issue where actually really high property prices are a massive drag on innovation.
Like Margate is now becoming a hub for food. Margate's going through that process where, and I went down there, there's a restaurant called Angelina's. Jay Rayner goes down there quite a lot, actually, because I think there's loads of good restaurants, but it's a prime example of where you don't have to be in London, and it's all about the context.
I'll give you three in Folkestone, okay, which is there's a fantastic place called Pick Up Pinchos, run by a guy who spent quite a lot of time learning the craft in San Sebastian. There is Annapurna, which is a Nepalese restaurant. There's a Gurkha regiment, I think, historically nearby, which is one of the best Indian restaurants and possibly the best value Indian restaurant I've ever been to. Sensationally good. There's obviously Rock Salt down on the harbour front, which is, posher, but again, astounding. Okay. There's not, and also, London has an awful lot of replication. I mean, how many branches of Pizza Express do you want? An awful lot of London scale just leads to replication. It doesn't lead to diversity at all.
But where I'm trying to, I suppose, go to this is lots of our listeners will think they need national distribution in a Waitrose or a Co-op or a Sainsbury's if you're a premium brand like our chili oil, for example. But what I think is interesting is context changes. It can change geographically as well. So, for example, you may think, I need to be in a Waitrose store in Sheffield, for example, or a Sainsbury's in Sheffield. Well, actually, the context of being in a Sainsbury's store in Sheffield, the shopper there won't want to spend money on a premium chili oil. But if you go to a very...
You'd be surprised. It's worth noting that because they're up north, they've got a bit more, they spend less money on property. Cars are better up north. But genuinely, the quality of motors is, you go to Newcastle, they've got a better, Londoners have shit cars or don't have cars at all.
Yeah, bicycles.
But
sorry, what I was trying to say is, but if you go for our listeners, but in all of these new cities that are up and coming, there's always going to be like an avant-garde coffee shop or an avant-garde, I don't know, these kind of quasi mini Whole Food come convenience. I don't know if you've seen them.
It's basically it's hipsters.
Hipsters, yes. Basically, attack the hipsters is what I'm trying to say across the country.
I'm massively pro-hipster.
It's where
hipsterism is the solution to the environmental crisis. It's the solution to, we ridicule these people, but it's an extraordinarily valuable thing because it contributes towards placemaking. You don't need that much hipsterism to make a place a lot more livable. And actually, let's not stereotype people because ordinary people like a bit of artisanship, right? They like a bit of variety. They like a bit of farmer's market, alongside supermarket. It's very, very wrong to think that hipsters are only selling to other hipsters.
For sure.
Let me explain. I'll make two very weird defences here, okay? Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, wrote a paper back in the 1960s asking why is the food in Britain so bad? It's a rich country, relatively, access to very good raw materials. Why is the food so bad? And Krugman's thesis was that it was simply because after rationing and World War II, and a whole variety of other things, the British had not really experienced really good food. Now, I dispute that, because I think we did have really good food in the shape of pies and other things. But because we'd never really experienced, we didn't have a frame of reference, and therefore we were content with things far worse than we should have been. That was Krugman's idea. Now, one valuable thing that hipsters do, is it expands your range of expectations upwards. Okay, so it raises your mental ceiling. The other organisations I'll defend as part of the ecosystem are chains. And I will die on the wall defending Starbucks, Costa Coffee, Travelodge, Premier Inn, Holiday Inn Express, right? What do those organisations do in the overall ecosystem? They raise the floor, okay? They say, if you're going to operate in this space, you've got to be at least as good as us, because otherwise you're going to fail. Now, you're not old enough to have tried to have stayed in a British hotel in 1979 or 1981. Trust me, okay? Before Travelodge and IHG and all these people came along, the odds were your experience could be absolutely shit. I mean, I remember the last of it staying in a seafront hotel in Brighton. Now, if you've got a seafront hotel in Brighton, you've got a pretty good licence to run a good hotel. And this was a case where the double bed was actually two single beds that had been cobbled together, and when your feet stuck to the carpet as you walked along the corridor, okay? And that was in the kind of probably early 2000s. Now, the great thing about everybody goes, Starbucks is fantastic, okay? Costa's fantastic because it basically says, this is table stakes now in the coffee world, and this is table stakes in the hotel world. Now you've got to try and beat us. Yeah. Now, also, I'd add the detail among the coffee connoisseurs who said, look, everybody slags off Starbucks, but if it weren't for Starbucks, I couldn't charge £3.40 coffee. Okay.
That's great, yeah.
And so the hipsters are great at raising the ceiling of expectations, and the chains are great at raising the floor.
And that makes, I suppose, that's if I'm applying this through the lens of food and drink.
What you don't want to do is buy a hipster sandwich when you've got a train to catch. By the way, but this is one of my mischievous ideas, which is to launch a. There used to be a Barber's at Paddington Station, which is occupying what used to be, I think, a public lavatory, and you went down a few flights of steps at Paddington, not far from kind of platform 10. And they're these elderly Italian guys. Now, the one thing is they were used to cutting the hair of people who had a train to catch. And they were the fastest goddamn barbers you've ever come across in your life. Okay. It wasn't any, what will you be doing this weekend, sir, and blah, blah, blah. It was bang, 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 bang.
Bosh it out.
I've got an idea for a chain of station-based coffee shops called Flat White or Fuck Off. Okay, and you get rid of all the choice, and you just Henry Ford produced flat whites. People come along, they tap their card, they pick up a coffee, they board the train. Okay, and because some if you've got a train to catch, that delay, if the person in front of you asks for a complicated iced drink, is absolutely infuriating, and it means you can't commit to having a coffee because you don't know what the queue is going to be like. Okay, that's the one thing. Okay, I briefly got distracted by myself, but I was talking about flat white or F off. I think this is an example, I suppose, for every good idea. There's an opposite idea which is also a good idea. In other words, taking the choice out of coffee altogether and tell people what to have. That was the hipster sandwich when you had a train to catch, which was there's a wonderful place called the Goods Shed in Canterbury, and we had about 15 minutes for our train, and I ordered my daughter, who's vegetarian, I think it was a brie and cranberry sandwich, and the chap there, even though we had a train to catch, I don't know if he knew we had a train to catch, produced it with almost glacial slowness and attention to detail, to a point where we were almost going insane. But I did ring my daughter when she'd boarded the train, and I said, "What was your sandwich like?" And she said, "It was easily the best sandwich I've ever had."
Any chance you can just borrow the laptop for 2 seconds or not?
You can borrow it. Weirdly, you can borrow it now.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just need to lend my wife a laptop.
Oh no, go for it.
There we go. Absolutely super.
No, it's so interesting. Look, I'm conscious of your time, so there's some questions I've just got to ask.
No, far away. I can probably take it through to 10:35, 40.
Okay, fantastic. So I asked this question to all guests, and I think it's interesting. But what would you say in one sentence? I've been dying to ask you this question more than anyone. What would you say in one sentence is a brand?
It's, first of all, because nobody says this, because brands are always described by people who are trying to improve them, it's the unit of evolutionary selection by which you can reward or punish good products or services or bad products or services, okay, to the extent that capitalism evolves better products and services through this unit of consumer selection. Okay, that's the first. I think people always talk about there's huge emotional attachment. You could argue it's the value paid for intangibles above and beyond that which is what you might call quantifiable or physical attributes of a product. Okay, you could say that. I think it's much more important than that. I think it's because in the Soviet Union, brands were considered un-Marxist. Okay. And you couldn't have branded products. The product was produced by factory number 104 in the so-and-so oblast, and they had a monthly target and a 5-year plan or whatever it might have been. Okay? And very quickly they had a problem because quality then becomes a race to the bottom. You meet the specification as minimally as you possibly can. There's no reward for producing a good product or punishment for producing a bad one because your products are commoditized. They're all mixed in, okay? Mm-hmm. They're all mixed together. Rivets, for example, from 8 different factories are supplied to a shipbuilder. And when 1/8 of the rivets start breaking, you don't know which factory is responsible for the faulty rivets, nor can you punish them by refusing to buy from them ever again. Because you've bought rivets from some central consolidated supply. All right? And the interesting thing there is, funnily enough, 2 things. One, I had a friend who actually grew up in Eastern Europe who said when they bought this chocolate bar, their mother instructed them to look underneath the flap, and if there was a letter B, to buy it, because factory B was the best chocolate factory of the 3 that made this bar. The problem in the Soviet Union, if you think about it, is if there's no punishment for being bad and there's no reward for being good, why would you innovate and try and make your product better? Now, okay, I'm talking about the Soviet Union here. That also applied in the UK to a very large extent to milk. Okay? You had the Milk Marketing Board, which guaranteed milk farmers a certain price for the milk, and then it was sold as a commodity. Now, admittedly, you got semi-skinned and you got gold top and blah, 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 blah. But until the Arlas came along and until the, I suppose, Daylesford and until Yo and so forth came along, okay? Basically, you made milk, you sold milk, it was sold as milk, as if it were the Soviet Union, okay? And there was no incentive to innovate, there was no incentive to differentiate, there was no incentive to add emotional value, okay? In fact, you destroyed the emotional value of allowing people to know they were drinking Herefordshire milk, or I guess in the case of, Rachel's, it'd be Welsh milk, or whatever, because dairy products should be Welsh. It's the rules, okay? All right? And so effectively you created a market which was, one, a race to the bottom on price, where all you could do was, bow down to the mercy of the supermarket buyers, because the consumer had no role in the selection process. Even if consumers had said, but I want to pay more for better milk, there was no mechanism for them to do so. And it also led to things like the horse meat crisis, because beef was being traded not as a branded good, but as a commodity. And so once you have something traded as a commodity, just as it was for the rivet manufacturer, there's an incentive for you to take shortcuts. As long as you meet the criteria, not of the end consumer, who is the only reasonable criterion for product quality and satisfaction, but some bureaucratic intermediary, okay? You used to get apparently absurdities in the Soviet Union in that there was an absolute epidemic in the 1950s of collapsing chandeliers. And it turned out that the factory that made chandeliers for public buildings in the Soviet Union was actually rewarded by weight, not by quantity. So they solved this problem by making very few chandeliers, which weighed about 4 tons each. And there was this fundamental problem, which is you'd attach them to replace the old Tsarist era chandelier, and the fucking ceiling would come down, right? And so when you have selection, not by the end beneficiary or consumer, but you have selection by some intermediary who is second-guessing the interests of the consumer, you always get a misalignment of effort, a failure to innovate, and ultimately a race to the bottom, where it becomes a price war and there's no margin left for anybody, which pretty much happened, I think, to milk producers, to be honest. Now, one of the things I've said this repeatedly to the milk people, look, a lot of us are buying half our milk to make coffee, right? We've got our Nespresso machine teed up, right? I won't hear a word against Nespresso either. I know it's fashionable to disparage it, but first thing in the morning, I'm not into tamping, right? Okay. Now, and I said, why has nobody produced barista milk? Because the frothing qualities of milk varies enormously according to things like the amount of buttermilk present and blah, blah, blah. Why are you not producing barista milk and selling it at a premium? But the emergence of milk brands creates value, both emotional. It creates emotional value for the consumer in the short term. It creates an incentive to innovate and to differentiate and to diversify in the longer term. It is both in the consumer's interest and in the manufacturer's interest, because it creates a better aligned form of value creation. And so that is not an advertising answer to the question, what is a brand? But I make no apology for that, because the advertising answer suggests that brands are a bit of magic fairy dust you add on top of a product to add a little bit of perceived value. Now, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that brands are entirely central to the efficient operation of innovation under free market conditions.
It's such an the most interesting answer I've probably had, Rory. And I know if you compare milk to dairy alt milk, that category, if you go down a supermarket now, there's 10, 15 brands. You've got Oatly, Rude Health, Minor Figures, all in of itself are driving that innovation. I suppose if you literally have them next to each other, milk versus alt milk, you kind of see how it kind of really adds colour to your point.
By the way, there's a nice thing about Britain, which is that we're not that stingy when we buy food. You know, a large part of the US and a large part of Germany kind of buys food on price. And the great thing about Brits being snobbish is, someone said that, you know, American grocery retailing is all about price. British discount grocery retailing is all about brand. And there's some interesting components there, by the way. Is Waitrose posh because it sells posher things than Tesco? Or is it posher than Tesco because of the things it doesn't sell, right? Or rather, you know, so when you go to Tesco, you will probably get 3 feet of facings of, what are those things called? Pop-Tarts, or, you know, toaster pockets or whatever, right? Waitrose might have one, okay? I'm always amused by going to Waitrose and seeing where they put the pork scratchings, which, by the way, is a gourmet food that doesn't deserve the opprobrium it receives, but let's park that. Goose scratchings, by the way, would be absolutely... The best food I've probably ever had was when St. John, the restaurant, we were there drinking in the bar, and they'd been producing goose, and they just put a whole bowl of goose scratchings on the bar. Oh. I don't think I've eaten anything better in my entire life. They were warm and fresh. Anyway, but Waitrose, you'll always see that they're on the bottom shelf, you know, slightly out of sight. They have to sell them, but they're not going to make a prominent display of them. So part of it is actually class prejudice through curation and merchandising. You know, there's a whole load of games going on here, I think. You know, an awful lot of what makes Waitrose posh is what they don't prominently sell rather than what they do.
It's I actually interviewed the CEO of Waitrose last week, James Bailey, and he said 80% of grocery, i.e. all the different supermarkets, 80% is cut and paste. So it's more or less logistic things. Once you understand most of it, the kind of the foundations, and then 20% is the point of difference. And it's kind of what you're saying here is they actually define themselves by what they're not. So what they don't stock, what they don't decide to take. And also, I don't know if there's a brand, I still hope it exists, which did duck scratchings, which were fucking unbelievable. I say myself. It was like the skin you get at a Chinese restaurant in a packet. It was just gorgeous. So I read somewhere that...
By the way, Waitrose also sort of lucked out because through luck, I think this is the former marketing director, luck rather than intention. They didn't open any absolutely huge shops. And so the trend has probably moved back towards shop more often, you know, for smaller amounts, which has, you know, possibly been to their advantage. So, you know, there are all sorts of interesting things going on, which is, can you be premium if you have a mega store is a really interesting question, you know. One thing I would like to say to everybody listening from grocery retail, by the way, is with only a mild irony, suggested during the pandemic that we should have had people banging pots and pans on one Thursday, not for the NHS as a change, but for people working in grocery retail logistics. Because the job that was done there and the resilience displayed there during the pandemic was miraculous. I mean, at the very beginning of the pandemic, when I heard that people like Goldman Sachs were assuming remote working for 9 months, and they probably know something we don't, okay, I was actually looking at the food cupboard with the mindset of a survivalist, thinking, what will these potatoes be like in 2 months' time, okay? In the event, I think, there were a couple of weeks where I was forced to buy my second favourite brand of breakfast cereal. I thought the extent to which that business kept running was worthy of investigation and worthy of, genuine acclaim. I thought it was astonishing.
I read somewhere you went for lunch with John Cleese, and he's got a book about creativity.
Well, I was going to mention that when you mentioned the creative process, because creativity, a short and helpful guide, is.
What would you say? Sorry. So I suppose first question is where did you guys go for lunch? I'm interested in those sort of things. And second question is, what would you say again in one sentence is creativity?
On one occasion we went to an Indian restaurant in Marylebone, the name of which I tragically can't remember, but it was very regal.
Gymkhana. Is it Gymkhana?
No, it wasn't that actually. I know Gymkhana and like it immensely. And by the way, to all your listeners, if you want a bargain, go to a Michelin-starred Indian restaurant and have the set lunch. Because, as we remarked earlier in relation to Dishoom, a significant number of people don't lunch at Indian restaurants. I had a boss who once said, "You don't go to an Indian at lunchtime." I go, "Well, 1.5 billion Indians do." It's not, but you can actually go and have a 25 quid set lunch at one of those Michelin-starred restaurants. And it's not, they don't skimp on the quantities either. It's astonishingly good value. The other time we went to a place called Saloo in Kinnerton Street, which is one of my favourites because it's a Pakistani restaurant, actually, unusually. Not Bengali, not Indian. And it does something called Halim Akbari, which is one of my favourite things of all time. So before you go to Saloo, check they've got the Halim Akbari on the menu.
What is Halim Akbari?
I think it's meat marinated with, if I'm right, it might be lentils and shoots. Over so it's a sort of stew, and then you put it on rice, and then you sprinkle bits of chili, ginger, and other things over the top, and it's just almost astoundingly. How would I describe it? It's almost astoundingly delicious. But Saloo is very expensive, but it's only very expensive qua Indian food. As a French restaurant, it wouldn't be considered expensive, and that's one of the prejudices that has driven me insane. The fact that people used to, less so now, but people used to grumble if they paid 25 quid for an Indian meal, but they'd happily pay 25 quid for a French meal, despite the fact that, in my view, Indian food is inordinately more sophisticated and interesting.
What's your, just randomly, next to Libani in Reigate is one of the best curry houses I've ever been to.
Go on,
and it's I can't remember the name, and it's an absolute travesty how it's never busy. It's never, what's it called? Saffron Summer. I don't understand. I don't understand how it's never busy, but I mean, it is. It's unbelievably, wonderfully delicious. But I'd love to know, because I love the curry.
Suddenly becoming this mecca?
I don't know. I don't know what it is. But I'd love to know what is your favourite curry restaurant, and what do you actually order at a curry? Because I could talk about that for days.
God, one of the things that's a bit strange with Indian restaurants is there's no. Okay, there are a few of those sort of very high end with cocktails places typically in Mayfair and central London, which are kind of premium Indians, and I like that, by the way. I don't always like it. There are a few I don't like, which is when they Frenchify it or Poncify it too much. When it's Indian food for people who don't like Indian food, and I've been to a few a few Indians in Knightsbridge which are like that, and it's kind of like heavily de-spiced and sort of Frankified French Indian food is forget it. Okay, yeah. If you're going to do that food, go all in. I was saying to someone last night that I regret, looking back in my life, that I wish I'd now bought all my clothes either from Primark or Versace. And this is what he's saying. I said, well, look, if you're going to go into fashion, right? Okay, just go in unapologetically, absolutely over the top, ridiculous. Okay. Highly camp, brilliant, absolutely outrageous, unapologetic display, which is Versace, okay? Or just stick with bog standard clothes. Don't dick around in the middle. I don't like Indian food being diluted. I don't think it needs that. But equally, I mentioned Annapurna in Folkestone. There's a place outside Dover called Namaste. One of the interesting things about Indian food, and funny enough, it was a French colleague of mine who remarked on this. She said, I prefer eating in Britain to eating in France, which for a French... Now, admittedly, she was Breton. Now, if you're Breton, you actually hate the rest of France. So maybe this was the reason. I mean, Bretons probably hate Parisians.
Why is that?
It's like a Welsh thing times 10. That they were actually kind of persecuted for speaking their own native language. They see themselves as culturally and ethnically distinct, blah, blah, to an extent. They have a language which was heavily suppressed by French centralising forces and so on. Mm-hmm. But anyway, she said, I said, well, why do you say that? She said, because everywhere you go, there's a chance of getting a really good Indian meal, for example. And that is a point where, the favourite Indian restaurant is a really difficult question to answer because they crop up in really unexpected places. Literally, you can pop into some pretty, sometimes some quite unprepossessing looking places and have something that's absolutely fantastic. But so, remind me of the name of the one in Reigate. It's called
Saffron Summer. But it's up there. It's astoundingly
this
delicious.
Is what I say. That what's interesting is you can, and one of the things that worries me a little bit is that. I'm a big fan of Lebanese food, huge fan of Korean food. But I do worry a little bit that general snobbishness and novelty seeking hurts the British Indian restaurant category because it's a kind of national treasure, actually. The fact that, this is my point about, I'm slightly ducking your question. No, I'm not. Kisa in Sevenoaks has been very good.
What do you order?
Very interesting. There's a fantastic thing at Kisa which I can never remember, but it's within the why it's perfect is it's within that narrow, very narrow Venn diagram of hot enough for me and not too hot for my wife, so we can both share it. And I always order chicken 65, by the way, as a first course. I'm a very big fan of all this sort of street foodie stuff. Those strange yogurt-like things with strange balls in them and so on, and little, but actually, of course, by the way, if we're being real purists, to say Indian food is an act of barbarity, because of course it varies enormously regionally. There's that wonderful kind of Drummond Street vegetarian Indian scene. I'm very happy going to vegetarian Indian restaurants. Very happy having, the dosa, etc. And so it's probably, if we're being honest, it's 10 cuisines, not one, or Indian might say sure. 150. But if the absolute default fallback position is probably the chicken madras, very big fan of a thing called, I like fenugreek, so there's a thing called jacuti, which I've always liked a lot. Particularly if you beef it up, because the contrast between the chili and the fenugreek is kind of yin and yang affair. There used to be a wonderful restaurant in London which was called Gopal's, which had a thing called mutton zakuti, which was almost
orgasmic.
It was almost orgasmic. Yeah. And I have to say, there's a joke I made, which is the fact that we crave Indian food when drunk. Maybe a recommendation, which is that it's deep down what our id really wants to eat.
Same with the kebab. Kebabs.
Yeah.
I went and got a kebab the other day from my local kebabi, and it was like they'd seen me 3 times completely annihilated over Christmas, and he was a bit like, "Why are you getting this?" And I was like, "Well, it's just because it's what I fancy." It's very, very good.
If you open a posh Turkish restaurant, okay, it's a kind of rule that you can't serve doner kebabs, isn't it? Now, I'm assuming the doner is Turkish in origin, or
It's like German, I think, because you've got all the Turks. Berlin's famous for its doners, I think. I think it's Turkish, but it's because they've got that restaurant which is. I used to live in Fulham. They've got one in Fulham called the German.
Oh yes, there's one in Bromley. German kebab house.
Yeah.
So I think there's one in Tunbridge Wells now too, as well.
That's a weird thing how that's kicking off.
But that is completely. That's a wonderful anomalous. Let's position our kebab shop as being German is one of the weirdest kind of branding choices. But it seems to have paid off again.
And they sell it on for I can never say it, focaccia instead of like a pitta. Sorry, just to go back to the original question, Rory.
I think the doner wrap is actually better than the doner kebab. Actually, I think it's better. The structure of the kebab is deeply flawed. I think.
Well, that goes back to your psychophysics and how things. Sorry, I could literally talk to you for hours, but I want to go to so John Cleese, Monty Python. He's got an amazing book about creativity. So you went to this restaurant in London. It sounds delicious. What did he tell you about creativity, and what is creativity? Because I think lots of our listeners listen to this to find ancillary, slightly weird ideas to implement in their business.
Well, first of all, buy his book because it's very short. You can read it in a single sitting. And as he said, it took him a long time to make the book that short, to cut it down to the absolute things. And I suppose what he'd say is whether or not different minds are more or less creative, what is inarguable is there is a creative mindset. And in order to be creative, you have to get yourself into a particular frame of mind. And another point, there are many more points in the book which are worth noting, is that you can't tailorize the production of creative ideas, by which I mean is that if you seek efficiency, quite often the best way to come up with a creative idea is to take a problem, leave it for your unconscious to digest, and then return to it. A sort of foible of mine, a fascination of mine, is cryptic crosswords, and I find it perpetually fascinating the extent to which you can stare at a crossword clue and get nowhere. Okay. And then you wander off, make a cup of tea, come back to it 10 minutes later, and the answer's obvious. And the extent to which there is a sort of technique around distracting yourself somehow, which is valuable to the creative process. It isn't something when literally it's a nose to the grindstone process. The whole he talks about the merits of sleeping on ideas, for example. There's the case where he lost a comedy script and much to his fury had to rewrite it. Then he found the original and discovered that the rewrite, which he'd written the following day, was actually much better than the original, because that, without being aware of it, his subconscious mind had actually worked at improving it somehow. And so there is an interesting thing we have to ask, which is the modern obsession with efficiency over effectiveness and kind of quantified productivity over what you might call quality assessment is probably inimical to creating a good creative culture. It drives me practically insane that advertising agencies are kind of paid by the hour, because there's absolutely no correlation between time spent and quality of product. It's a terrible perverse incentive.
I completely agree. Like I do think what we were saying at the beginning. I do think some people are creative, but I definitely think it's a mindset that can be taught, and it should be taught for our founders listening to this with their teams. And it's like, if you say you've got to come up with a way around problem X, like start. I know starter finishers get kind of berated, but I actually think that's the best way to be creative. You start on something you give a bit of breathing space, then you go back. Stephen King talks about the closed door and the open door. So he'll always write a first draft close. And it was like he writes that door and then he shuts that door and he leaves the idea and he says it's almost like a sourdough loaf baking. He lets it like kind of breathe. Then he opens the door and then that's when he has the second draft, and that's where the ideas come from. But there's something about starting something, letting it breathe into your subconscious, going on a walk, that's what, and then going back to it. And I think there's real value in that.
And I think we won't win this battle at all until we somehow stop people. This is why I got a bit pissy when people said, typical Tory government making people learn maths. It's just a war on creativity. Well, I don't want the word creative to mean bad at maths, right? That's why I don't like that line of argument. No, he's shit at maths, can't spell, can't do anything, but very creative, right? I don't want creative to be a compensation for deficiencies, okay? And we always seem to define creativity in opposition to something else, not as an additive value. Okay, and that really bothers me because it's kind of like, in many spheres, obviously accountancy, in finance, the word creative takes on negative connotations. In other spheres, it gets treated as like a cute optional extra, something which you can take it or leave it. And I don't think that's true at all. I think that actually deep within creativity is a form of rigour, which is that you fully explore the solution space before you define and attempt to solve the problem. And the best form of creativity, by the way, is rewriting the question. Now, in GCSE maths, you're not allowed to rewrite the question. In advanced maths, great mathematicians solve problems by effectively rewriting the question in a different form, which is more amenable to solution. And that was my point, I suppose, the Eurostar story, which got me a bit famous on TED for a while, was, are you really trying to make the train journey faster when you should be trying to make the journey more enjoyable, more appealing, more productive? In other words, should you be reducing the quantity of time spent on the train with your $6 billion budget, or could you not spend a far lesser amount of money improving the quality of that time?
And that's when you talk about getting the like putting champers on the train. I think I've listened to that.
And people thought it was a whimsical suggestion. It is and it isn't. I mean, putting Wi-Fi on the train, it was ridiculous that they'd spent $6 billion making the trains faster, and it took them another 11 years to spend what was perhaps $6 million putting Wi-Fi on the trains. That's 0.1% of the cost. For an improvement that might make more difference to someone's decision to travel by train rather than by air.
But what you said there about changing the question is a form of creativity, and that ultimately what I was trying to get to with this whole conversation is, how do our founders unlock alchemy within themselves and their team? And I think it's changing the question. What are some of the really, and what you talk about in the book is how
there's a great one, which is that
right.
Apparently there were some people in the French Foreign Legion who are being trained by British military people. I don't know what the circumstances were. And the first exercise they had was to, I think, build a bridge over something. Right? And so these people immediately started discussion and started picking up bits of wood. And the British Army person said, "You failed already." Right?
Right.
Said, well, how have we failed? Said, "You didn't ask why we were building the bridge. Because if you wanted to know what the ultimate objective was, you might be able to say, well, why are we building a bridge when there's a perfectly passable ford upstream, right? If you simply mindlessly obey orders without actually asking why or what the ultimate objective is, you can very efficiently pursue something which shouldn't be done at all. And so it didn't matter how good your bridge was. If you didn't want to know why the bridge was being built in the first place, you'd failed at the first hurdle.
So efficiency almost blinds us from effectiveness. We kind of like almost masturbate over efficiency.
Genuine effectiveness requires a really, really tough question of asking, where do we play in this market? How do we win? And that's an exploratory, creative act of saying, how do we define success? what are we really trying to do? Are we trying to make a train journey faster, which engineers will naturally assume is the objective, or are we trying to get passengers out of the planes and into the trains? Because those two separate questions, although they're not totally unrelated, undoubtedly faster trains net will get people out of planes, but are they the questions you should be asking? I mean, interestingly, even when the Eurostar took 3 hours or whatever it was, when it was slow, it was very simple whether I flew or whether I took the train, which was absolutely childishly simple. I always took the train to Brussels if I was going to our agency in Brussels, which was in the centre of Brussels and not far from the train station. I used to have a client in Brussels, DHL as it was, which was next to the airport, and when I was visiting them, I used to fly, okay?
Yeah.
Right? And so... You know, a question like, should we establish a station just outside Brussels so that people who are going to elsewhere in the country, you know, that might be a more interesting question than do we make the trains faster between 2 points?
And so what you said there, because just in terms of, I basically want our anyone listening to this to be able to take it to their team tomorrow and to get them to think creatively. So you talked about the question you used for grads was, how do you get people to eat curry at lunch, I think it was, or how do you get people to... Are there any other examples of this, like one, two, or three of which can kind of plunge people into the depths of alchemy?
I'll give you one that nobody's solved, which is, as a hotel, okay, we know from behavioural science there's something called the peak end rule. And people tend to disproportionately be influenced in their memory of an experience by how it starts, how it ends, and the von Restorff spike, which is the most distinctive moment they encounter in between. Okay? So with a hotel, it might be, if you have a great check-in experience, your mood and your inclination to like the hotel will be amplified for the rest of your stay. If during the hotel stay something pretty remarkable happens, like someone does something very useful for you, okay, or is disproportionately kind or helpful, that will also have an effect on the memory. And then the third point is effectively checkout. And nobody has yet worked out a way to make the checkout experience feel amazing.
So true.
That's not quite true. I had a friend who stayed at the Manoir Cat Saison, and as he left in the morning, he stayed overnight after the meal. They said, and here are some hand-baked cookies for your journey home, or biscuits, they would have called them. Okay? So, now, obviously, that's because the hotel's in the middle of nowhere. Everybody comes by car. If you're a New York hotel and people are taking the taxi to JFK, it'd be a bit weird to hand them a packet of biscuits. Okay, I've had a few hotels, obviously in Arizona, where when they collect the valet car for you, they always give you a couple of bottles of water, which is probably sensible in Arizona in any case. But it's pretty nice. But other than that, is there a way in which a hotel could really make itself distinctive in terms of the mode of checkout? Don't know, but it's fascinating.
Absolutely. Look, conscious of time, so final question. Is, I know you're extremely well read. I'd love to know.
Not as much as I'd like, actually. I'm behind now.
I think you've got to absolutely read this. This will categorically, The War of Art. I think I've read it about 10 times. I'm obsessed with it. I'd love to know. What is your favourite fiction book? Because I've heard you reference a lot of kind of non-fiction books. But
I wish I'm remiss in that in the last 10 years I've read much less fiction than I'd like. I'll give you a couple which I've really enjoyed. One of them is called Red Plenty by Francis Spufford, which is a description in novelistic form of the problems you encounter in a Soviet-controlled economy.
What was it? Red
Plenty. Red Plenty.
As in red.
Red,
as
R-E-D, and then Plenty, P-L-E-N-T-Y.
Cool.
And as a piece of masterly comic writing, this is about 20 years old now, maybe even more, Under the Frog by Tibor Fischer. which is also set, by the way, east of the Iron Curtain, and it's about effectively some basketball players in Hungary, which sounds getting surreal, but I think basketball is actually quite big in, certainly very big
and Greece,
in Yugoslavia, Greece, France, etc. Much bigger than the UK. Basketball players in Hungary in the lead up to 1956, which is absolutely fantastic. There's another great book of his called The Thought Gang, which is about someone who teams up with a French philosopher to commit crimes, which is kind of fascinating.
Fantastic. And then final one is the best kind of non-fiction, because obviously our listeners have to buy Alchemy. It's just it's mandatory reading. But other than, like, what are the books that have been really pertinent to your thinking?
If you're interested in transport, called Transport for Humans, which I co-wrote. To be honest, he did more of the work than me, with Pete Dyson, who's a very brilliant guy. And he's a behavioural scientist and social geographer, and it's about the behavioural science of transport. So I should plug that. But another book that I found extremely good, there's one called The Business of Brands by a guy I think called Matt Johnson, if I'm right, who's the author of Blindsight. That was a very good book indeed as well. And there's also a book it's called The Brand Book by Daryl Fielding. I really recommend that as well.
Fantastic. Okay, Rory. Well, look. Is that your?
Okay.
Is that your?
I better go. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I've got to dash. No, I know I've got to leave this for it to upload. That's right, isn't it?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Sorry, what I'm saying.
Thank you so much, Rory.
Hello. What's going on? Hello. Yeah, I'll go do this now. Wait a second. Hello? Oh, you're coming out, okay.
Yes, I've already let you in.
Oh, thanks ever so much, thank you.
I'll let you go, Rory, but that's been an absolute pleasure, and I'm very grateful. Let me know if you need any more chocolate or chili oil.
I wouldn't mind, actually, any time, but don't worry soon, because what you've given us has been fantastically generous. Thank you very much indeed.
No worries. Have a lovely day. Take care.
You too, and I'll wait for it to upload.
Yeah, please. Or you can just leave.